The reality is that men are hurting and that the whole culture responds to them by saying, "Please do not tell us what you feel." That quote is not from a alt-right self-help guru. It's not from a men's rights advocate. No, this quite striking remark comes from the feminist writer Bell Hooks in her book, The Will to Change. In this video, I want to talk about what it means to be a man in a patriarchal society. And I want to recommend this book to you as something that I think personally has generated a lot of thoughts and self-reflection for me. And I hope it is something that can be helpful for you as well. Bell Hooks was a prominent womanist and feminist writer, and the existence of this book, of a feminist taking on the question of what it means to be a man, I think already disproves one of the main talking points of anti-feminism, which is that feminism is about hating men. Instead, what this book does is it truly looks at the situation of what it means to be a man within a patriarchal society, and it does so not to condemn men, but to condemn patriarchy as a system that affects both men and women. And so Hooks does this by not softening her feminism, but actually by leaning more fully into it. And so Hooks's book is a very helpful study in that regard, because it really is looking at the problem of masculinity within a patriarchal system. Let me just read that quote again that I started with. "The reality is men are hurting, and that the whole culture responds to them by saying, 'Please do not tell us what you feel.'" Now, there's two things to note about this. The first is that the concept of what culture is being discussed is patriarchal culture. It's not just a general culture, but it's specifically patriarchal culture that Bell Hooks is discussing. And the second point is the reality that men are hurting. I think that is verifiable from the suicide statistics, from mental health statistics. We know that men are more likely to commit suicide, to more likely to feel lonely. Not that they're exclusive in that regard, but the statistics around, especially suicide, are quite drastically skewed in favor of men being more prone towards that. And so many men have recognized this today, and they've recognized that they're not given permission to feel vulnerable or to show their emotions. Yet they're not always willing or able to connect that fact with the reality of patriarchy. Later in the book, Hook writes, "Patriarchy demands of men that they become and remain emotional cripples." And I think this is a widespread experience for men. I know it's something that I can speak to for myself. It's implied that what it means to be a man involves being a stoic figure who can weather any storm and does not show any signs of being weak. In fact, the very definition of what it is to be a man is often a negative definition, meaning it is a list of things that you are not allowed to be. For example, you cannot be vulnerable. You cannot cry. You should do your duty and never complain about it. You should take hardship on the chin and suffer pain for those who are around you without it letting it affect you, or at least not letting it show. But the reality is it does affect you. It does affect our emotional being. And so whether we like it or not, men are just as emotional and vulnerable and as afraid as women are. And that's because men are human beings. And so something I learned from Hooks in this book is that the patriarchal definition of what it means to be a man is essentially that men are not women. It suggests that what it means to say be a man is to not be a woman, not to be fragile and weak and vulnerable and needy, but the opposite, to be strong, stoic, and self-reliant. And so this is what patriarchy looks like. And this is why it affects both men and women. Patriarchy, in that regard, is inherently prone to foster violence against women for that exact same reason, because the definition of manhood within patriarchy is to be not a woman. And so by defining manhood in that regard, it is a system that is prone to violence against women. And thankfully today, there's a little bit more grace in our culture for men to be vulnerable, to be weak, but it's not always the case. Especially even in the church culture, There's some space for this within a very small area of either confession or like a men's group or something like that. But there's also the very toxic version of masculinity that's promoted amongst some of the right-wing or conservative pastors and theologians who lift Jesus up as this kind of John Wayne figure and as this stoic masculine figure. And so there's a strong disconnect between giving space for vulnerability in theory and actually allowing for it to exist and to thrive without judgment or resentment. And I think this exists both within the church spaces, but also within relationships within men and women. The psychologist Brene Brown once gave a very moving talk. I believe it was a TED Talk around this subject. She's a famous researcher known around the world for her work on vulnerability. But one day at a book signing, she tells this story that a man came up to her and asked why she doesn't study men. And she just said, I don't study men. And he said that's quite convenient. He went on to explain that the books that she was signing for him were for his wife and daughter. They loved her books. But the truth of the matter is that they would rather see him die on his white horse than to ever see him fall off of it. And he went on to say that it's the women in his life who are the hardest on him and that demand the most of him and the least tolerant of his vulnerability. And Brown concludes from that if you show her a woman that can sit with a man in his pain and his vulnerability, then that's a woman that's done tremendous work. And I think the story that Brene Brown tells is quite interesting because it does get to this factor of what patriarchy does to both men and women. Men are told not to be women, and women reinforce that messaging in patriarchy subconsciously. There's another viral clip that's been going around that I think is relevant here too. It shows a man who's sitting with a spool of wire, and he comments to his wife about how much of that wire has passed away. And it's this beautiful lament that he gives about how his life is slipping away, and he feels like he's losing so much of his life. And his wife turns to him and mocks him for this very vulnerable, humble moment. And it's quite a tragic video to watch in reality. And even the subconscious way that it works out that she mocks him for this. A lot of men in the comments shared that they've had similar experiences where women say that they want men to be vulnerable, but whenever they truly are vulnerable, that vulnerability somehow becomes weaponized against them. You're not a true man, or it becomes resentment of weakness or whatever else. And in a way, am I trying to say that women are in any way to blame? We have to keep in mind that the problem is patriarchy, not specifically men or women as individual actors. It is a culture and a systemic issue that is the problem here. That's the ultimate point that I think Bell Hooks shows, but a number of feminist writers will show as well. And so please hear me. This is a space to talk about the issue of men and masculinity within a broader feminist framework. I think unapologetically Hooks is a feminist, and I would say in the same regard that I'm convinced by feminism as being an accurate interpretation of how society runs. Bell Hooks gets into something similar, a similar dynamic in her book when she talks about the relationship between mothers and young boys. The first sentence of her third chapter really broke my heart when I read it. She writes this. She says, "Boys are not seen as lovable in patriarchal culture." She then goes on to say that being lovable is not the same thing as benefiting from patriarchy. Nobody's saying that men do not benefit from patriarchy, but what she's suggesting is that is not the same thing as being lovable. And so the rewards of patriarchy are not the same as being loved. And in fact, they're kind of antithetical to being loved. There's quite a bit of hindrances to being loved because masculinity is defined by the ability to succeed, to perform, to climb the ladders of corporate success or personal success. And the moment a man shows any failure or weakness in that regard, they're no longer deemed lovable. But were they actually lovable, or were they not just accepted because of how they can perform? And so Hooks traces how this emotional abandonment of boys leads to anger as the only outlet of a real, true masculine emotion. You see this in movies, and you see this in all kinds of things too. Anger is totally acceptable for a man to show. It's almost celebrated. But anger isn't really a true emotion. In many regards, anger just masks an emotion. It's the inability to express an emotion that then leads to these outbursts of rage. And so Hooks comments about how the first act of violence within a patriarchal system is that it demands men not to do violence against someone else, but to do violence against their very self, against their soul. It is the violence of disengagement from emotions that a man is asked to do. Bell Hooks quotes a figure named Terrence Real, who explains, "The real phrase, 'be a man,' means suck it up and keep going. Disconnection is not fallout from traditional masculinity. Disconnection is masculinity." And so this, for Bell Hooks, is an act of psychological self-mutilation. And so the first act of violence that patriarchy demands of men is against themselves. And the only avenue that they're able to express this pain and this disconnection is through anger. And this reminds me of quite a beautiful quote from the writer James Baldwin. He says, "I think one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense, once it is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain." It is very easy to get angry and to live your whole life oriented around what you hate or who you hate. But it is so much harder to sit with your pain and do the hard work of healing. The self-mutilation that Hooks describes has important implications for male sexuality and work. In a culture that views men as animals, needing sex to fulfill a physical need, strictly a physical need, it is assumed that men are not also looking for an emotional connection and a deep sense of love and belonging. Hookup culture, in contrast, is an empty solution to this problem. It is trying to fulfill this need. Likewise, work has become an endless treadmill of performing for love, but it never satisfies the deep need of being truly seen and known and loved for who you are, not for what you can do. And even with sexuality becomes instrumentalized as an act, as a performance, as something that you're good at. And I think that language is quite revealing about how we think about masculinity, that it's not an act of vulnerability or an act of mutual, just deep connection. It is an act of performance. And so to be a man in this sort of situation is to live a fractured life. Hook quotes the therapist John Bradshaw, who puts words to this in quite a beautiful way. He writes, "The feeling that I have done something wrong, that I really don't know what it is, that there's something terribly wrong with my very being, leads to a sense of utter helplessness. This hopelessness is the deepest cut of the mystified state. It means there is no possibility for me as I am. There is no way I can matter or be worthy of anyone's love as long as I am myself. I must find a way to be someone else, someone who is lovable, someone who is not me." By learning to wear a mask, men within patriarchal culture live in this tension. There is the longing to be loved for who you truly are, but also the reality that patriarchy cuts off men from their emotional selves. They live fractured lives. So the messaging and the lived experience of men is that they deeply long to be understood, yet they are denied the freedom to be vulnerable in such a way that they might actually find love and acceptance for who they truly are. Because a weak man, a vulnerable man, a man who bears those emotions freely is not a lovable man according to patriarchy. And men have lived their lives with reminders of this reality. In theory, most people would not tell a man that they are unlovable unless they perform certain things. That's not directly stated. But the lived reality of patriarchy brings with it continual reminders of precisely that messaging. There is a male loneliness epidemic that many researchers and sociologists have noted, but it's not unrelated to this messaging and this reality. And Christian circles are oftentimes no better at accepting vulnerability, but whenever they do have some space for it, it's only to specific situations, as I mentioned before. And so what's the solution here? What is the problem? Obviously, we're discussing this idea of being a man and this messaging around what it means, but I don't think there's an easy answer here. I don't think Hooks offers a simple solution either. She analyzes quite well the reality of what it is to be a man within patriarchy, but ultimately the only real solution is to come to an end of patriarchy, to liberate both women and men from the conditions of a patriarchal society and culture. I think identifying patriarchy as a common obstacle is quite necessary in that regard. There's an anti-feminist men's movement that a lot of alt-right influencers kind of tap into, but I think they wrongfully place the blame on feminism. They say that feminism is what's destroying men's lives, and feminism is what's making things so hard to be a man. I think that's exactly the opposite problem. I think feminism is an ally for this very same problem. And I think Hook's book demonstrates that quite beautifully and quite well. So we cannot go to some utopian past situation where men could be men and women could be women. That's kind of that alt-right conservative dream. The only way to truly heal is to move forward beyond patriarchy, to reimagine and to reconstruct society along liberation for both men and women. Hooks does, however, offer some solutions or some concrete steps for men to take, namely that they should embrace their emotions more directly, even if it means being misunderstood and rejected by people close to them, especially if it means being rejected by the women in their lives. Hooks writes, "To heal, men must learn to feel again. They must learn to break the silence, to speak the pain. Often men, to speak the pain, first turn to the woman in their lives and are refused a hearing. In many ways, women have bought into the patriarchal masculine mystique. Asked to witness a male expressing feelings, to listen to those feelings and respond, they simply turn away." Hooks tells some of her own experiences in this regard as a feminist writer, where in her interactions with partners or other men, she had to learn this herself. She had to learn the difficult fact of rejecting the patriarchal mindset within her own thinking about men. But this difficulty, this hurdle, is not a reason not to try, not to truly embrace our emotions and our vulnerability as men. Because there are women who can sit and listen to men in their vulnerability and pain and who don't reject them or resent them or weaponize that pain. But men have to do the hard work first of getting in touch with themselves, of feeling again. They must practice speaking their pain openly and vulnerably. And first, they have to practice speaking that pain to themselves. I think a big part of the issue is men are just disconnected with their emotional life. And that's a big part of why anger is the only outlet, because anger is just voiceless. It has no content. It's just anger. Whereas pain and emotion is something heavier and it more challenging for us. It's easy just to be angry. It's very hard to sit with yourself and understand where that anger is coming from and where those emotions are coming from. And so it's important to talk about this issue for a number of reasons. I wanted to make this really for two reasons. The first is I wanted to commend Bell Hooks' book to you. I think it's a profoundly beautiful book. I found it incredibly thought-provoking, and it spoke directly to some experiences I've had. And I think it's well worth reading. It's an emotional book, of course. But it's a book that disproves as well the myth that feminism is against men, that it's anti-men. And I think even reading this book has been an encouragement for me to seek out more feminist authors and read them. And second, I think it's worth discussing this on my channel specifically, because I think there's a lot of online spaces and online communities that talk about this issue within the wrong framework. They talk about it within the anti-feminist framework. And so there's a lot of, like I've said, these conservative or these alt-right movements that talk about this in the problematic ways. And so I hope you find this video both challenging and encouraging. I truly hope that you're comforted by the fact that you're not alone in your pain. Hopefully some of these quotes and some of these things I've shared resonate with you. And I'm still learning a lot of this. I'm still growing in this. I just wanted to share some of the things that I've learned from this book. I read it about halfway through last year, and it's been on my mind, and it's been something I've returned to a number of times. I hope maybe it's a book that you would consider looking into, or even if this video is enough to kind of tease your interest, that you would consider looking more into her work. But for now, I just want to say thanks for watching this video. Let me know if you have any comments or questions below. But yeah, thanks for watching and have a great day.